I have used the term tranquility for the fourth element making up the spirit of the art of tea, but it may not be a good term for all that is implied in the Chinese character chi, or jaku in Japanese. Jaku is sabi, but sabi contains much more than tranquility. Its Sanskrit equivalent, shanta or shanti, it is true, means tranquility, peace, serenity, and jaku has been frequently used in Buddhist literature to denote death or nirvana. But as the term is used in the tea, its implication is poverty, simplification, aloneness, and here sabi becomes synonymous with wabi. To appreciate poverty, to accept whatever is given, a tranquil passive mind is needed. But in both sabi and wabi, there is a suggestion of objectivity. Just to be tranquil or passive is not sabi, nor is it wabi. There is always something objective that evokes in one a mood to be called wabi. And wabi is not merely a psychological reaction to a certain pattern of environment. There is an active principle of aestheticism in it. When this is lacking, poverty becomes indigence. Aloneness becomes ostracism or misanthropy or inhuman unsociability. Wabi or sabi, therefore, may be defined as an active aesthetical appreciation of poverty. When it is used as a constituent of the tea, it is the creating or remodeling of an environment in such a way as to awaken the feeling of wabi or sabi. Nowadays, as these terms are used, we may say that sabi applies more to the individual objects and environment generally, and wabi to the living of a life ordinarily associated with poverty or insufficiency or imperfection. Sabi is thus more objective, whereas wabi is more subjective and personal. We speak of wabi-zumai, the wabi way of living. But when a vessel such as a tea caddy, or a bowl, or a flower vase comes in for appraisal, it is often characterized as having a sabi taste, or kanmi. Kan and sabi are synonymous, while mi is taste. The tea utensils are, as far as I know, never qualified as being of wabi taste. Of the following two verses, the first is considered expressive of the idea of wabi, while the second gives the idea of sabi. Among the weeds growing along the wall, the crickets are hiding, as if forsaken, from the garden wet with autumnal showers. The yomogi herbs in the garden are beginning to wither from below. Autumn is deepening, its colors are fading. Not knowing why, my heart is filled with melancholy. The idea of sabi is said to come primarily from Renga masters, who show great aesthetic appreciation for things suggestive of age, desiccation, numbness, chilliness, obscurity, all of which are negative feelings opposed to warmth, the spring, expansiveness, transparency, etc. They are, in fact, feelings growing out of poverty and deficiency, but they have also a certain quality lending themselves to highly cultivated aesthetic ecstasy. The tea men will say that this is objectively negated but subjectively affirmed, whereby external emptiness is filled with inner richness. In some ways, wabi is sabi, and sabi is wabi. They are interchangeable terms. Shuko, who died in 1502, a disciple of Ikkyu and tea master to Ashikaga Yoshimasa, used to teach his pupils about the spirit of the tea with this story. A Chinese poet happened to compose this couplet. In the woods over there, deeply buried in snow, last night a few branches of the plum tree burst out in bloom. He showed it to his friend, who suggested that he alter a few branches into one branch. The author followed the friend's advice, praising him as his teacher of one character. A solitary branch of the plum tree in bloom among the snow-covered woods. Here is the idea of wabi. On another occasion, Shuko is reported to have said, It is good to see a fine steed tied in the straw-roofed shed. This being so, it also is especially fine to find a rare object of art in an ordinarily furnished room. This reminds one of the Zen phrase, to fill a monk's tattered robe with a cool, refreshing breeze. Outwardly there is not a sign of distinction. Appearances all go against the contents, which are in every way priceless. A life of wabi can then be defined, an inexpressible quiet beneath poverty. And it is the art of tea that tries to express this idea artistically. But if there is anything betraying a trace of insincerity, the whole thing is utterly ruined. The priceless contents must be there most genuinely. They must be there as if they were never there. They must be rather accidentally discovered. In the beginning there is no suspicion of the presence of anything extraordinary, yet something attracts, a closer approach, a tentative examination, and behold, a mine of solid gold glitters from among the unexpected. But the gold itself remains ever the same, discovered or not. It retains its reality, that is, its sincerity to itself, regardless of accidents. Wabi means to be true to itself. A master lives quietly in his unpretentious hut. A friend comes in unexpectedly, tea is served, a fresh spray of flowers is arranged, and the visitor enjoys a peaceful afternoon charmed with his conversation and entertainment. Is this not the tea rite in its reality? Parenthetically, some may ask, in these modern times, how many of us are situated like the tea master? It is nonsense to talk about leisurely entertainment. Let us have our bread first, and fewer working hours. Yes, it is true that we have to eat bread in the sweat of our face and to work a number of hours as the slave of machinery. Our creative impulses have thus been miserably downtrodden. It is not, however, just for this reason, I believe, that we moderns have lost the taste for leisureliness, that we find no room in our worrying hearts for enjoying life in any other way than running after excitement for excitement's sake. The question is, how have we come to give ourselves up to such a life as to try to keep the inner worries only temporarily suppressed? How is it that we no longer reflect on life more deeply, more seriously, so that we can have a realization of its innermost meaning? When this question is settled, let us, if necessary, negate the entire machinery of modern life and start anew. I hope our destination is not the continual enslaving of ourselves to material wants and comforts. Another tea master writes of Amaterasu Omikami, really the sun goddess in Japanese mythology, but the writer seems to understand her to be a male deity and anachronistically associates her with the art of tea. His words are, "From Amaterasu Omikami starts the spirit of wabi. Being the great ruler of this country, he was free to erect the finest palaces inlaid with gold and silver and precious stones, and nobody would dare to speak ill of him. And yet he dwelt in a reed-thatched house and ate unpolished rice. In every possible way, besides, he was self-sufficient, modest, and ever striving. He was truly a most excellent tea master, living a life of wabi." Unquote. It is interesting to see that this writer regards Amaterasu Omikami as the representative tea man who lived a life of wabi. This, however, shows that the tea is the aesthetic appreciation of primitive simplicity. In other words, that the tea is an aesthetic expression of the longing which most of us seem to feel in the depths of our hearts to go as far back to nature as our human existence will permit, and to be at one with her. Through these statements, the concept of wabi is, I think, becoming clearer. We can say that, in a way, with Sotan, a grandson of Rikyu, real wabi life starts. He explains that wabi is the essence of the tea, corresponding to the moral life of the Buddhists. It is a great mistake indeed to make an ostentatious show of wabi while inwardly nothing is consonant with it. Such people construct a tea room as far as appearances go, with all that is needed for wabi, Much gold and silver is wasted on the work. Rare objects of art are purchased with the money realized by the sale of their farms, and this just to make a display before visitors. They think a life of wabi is here, but far from it. Wabi means insufficiency of things, inability to fulfill every desire one may cherish, generally a life of poverty and dejection. To halt despondently in one's course of life because of one's inability to push oneself forward, this is wabi. But one does not brood over the situation. One has learned to be self-sufficient with insufficiency of things. One does not seek beyond one's means. One has ceased to be cognizant of the fact that one is in tight circumstances. If, however, one should still abide with the idea of the poverty, insufficiency, or general wretchedness of his condition, one would no more be a person of wabi, but a poverty-stricken person. Those who really know what wabi is are free from greed, violence, anger, indolence, uneasiness, and folly. Thus wabi corresponds to the paramita of morality as observed by the Buddhists." Unquote. In wabi, aestheticism is fused with morality or spirituality, and it is for this reason that the tea masters declare the tea to be life itself and not merely a thing for pleasure, however refined this may be. Zen is thus directly connected with the tea. Indeed, most ancient tea masters studied Zen in real earnest and applied their attainment in Zen to the art of their profession. Religion can sometimes be defined as a way of escape from the humdrum of this worldly life. Scholars may object to this, saying that religion aspires not to escape, but to transcend life in order to reach the absolute or the infinite. But practically stated, it is an escape where one finds a little time to breathe and recuperate. Zen as a spiritual discipline does this too, but as it is too transcendental, as it were, too inaccessible for ordinary minds, the tea masters who have studied Zen have devised the way to put their understanding into practice in the form of the art of tea. Probably in this, to a great extent, their aesthetic aspirations asserted themselves. When wabi is explained as above, readers may think that it is more or less a negative quality, and that its enjoyment is meant for people who have been a failure in life. This is true in some sense, perhaps, but how many of us are really so healthy as not to need medicine or a tonic of one kind or another at some time in their lives? And then, every one of us is destined to pass away. Modern psychology gives us many cases of active businessmen, strong physically and mentally, who will suddenly collapse when they retire. Why? Because they have not learned to keep their energy in reserve. That is to say, they have never become aware of a plan to retreat while still working. The Japanese fighting man in those old days of strife and unrest, when he was most strenuously engaged in the business of war, realized that he could not go on always with nerves at the highest pitch of vigilance, and that he ought to have a way of escape sometime and somewhere. The tea must have given him exactly this. He retreated for a while into a quiet corner of his unconscious, symbolized by the tea room, no more than 10 feet square. And when he came out of it, not only did he feel refreshed in mind and body, but very likely his memory was renewed of things of more permanent value than mere fighting. Thus we see that tranquility, which is the fourth and chief factor making up the spirit of the tea, ultimately means a kind of aesthetic contemplation of poverty in the Eckhartian sense, which the tea men call wabi or sabi, according to the objects to which they apply the term. Two Zen men of the 10th century were discussing Zen. One named Chokei said, "Even a fully enlightened arhat may be proclaimed to be still harboring something of the 3 poisonous passions, greed, anger, and delusion. But as to the Buddha, he never makes an equivocal statement. Whatever he asserts is absolute truth. What do you say to this?" Hofuku asked, "What then is the Buddha's statement?" Chokei said, "The deaf cannot hear it." This was criticized by Hofuku. You are coming down onto a secondary level. Chokei. What then is the Buddha's statement according to your judgment? Hofuku. Have a cup of tea, O my brother monk. Tea drinking is quite an innocent deed, and we practice it in our everyday life, especially in the East. But when it is taken up by the Zen men, it turns out to be a momentous event that leads directly up to Buddhahood and its absolute truth. Ordinary-minded people may well wonder how such a transformation could take place, even by subtle verbal tricks of the Zen masters. But the fact is that their world is not the same as the one in which ordinary-minded, sense-bound people live. This does not mean that a tree is not a tree in one world and is a tree in another world, though there is something almost like this in the Zen world. For in the latter, what is at once what is and what is not. The mountain confronting us, you and me, is a mountain and not a mountain. The pen I hold in my hand is a pen and not a pen. The Zen man sees things from this point of view. To him, therefore, the tea drinking is not just drinking tea. It comes directly from and goes deeply down into the roots of existence. According to Eckhart, a flea, as it is in God, ranks above the highest angel in himself. Thus in God all things are equal, and are God himself. When Shozan, the Zen teacher, and Ho, the Zen layman, both of the 8th century Tang dynasty, were enjoying tea, Ho raised the tokusu, which is something like a saucer, but made of wood with a base, and said, "Each one of us has his, and why cannot he say something about it?" Shozan said, "It is just because each one of us has his that he is unable to say something about it." Ho retorted, "How is it then that you seem to be able to say something about it?" Shozan protested, "One cannot remain without saying something." Ho said, "There you are." To these two Zen men, too, the takusu was not just a takusu. It had a far deeper signification than the one we, the ordinary-minded, usually attach to it. It is for this reason, briefly, that the Japanese make so much of tea drinking, as if it was something mysteriously touching the very foundation of reality. In all likelihood, it is not as if, but the thing itself, and from the art of tea we have an insight into the spirit of Oriental culture. The tea drinking that is known as cha no yu in Japanese, and as tea ceremony or tea cult in the West, is not just drinking tea. It involves all the activities leading to it, all the utensils used in it, the entire atmosphere surrounding the procedure, and last of all, what is really the most important phase, the frame of mind or spirit which mysteriously grows out of the combination of all these factors. The tea drinking, therefore, is not just drinking tea, but it is the art of cultivating what might be called the psychosphere, that is to say, the structure or pattern of consciousness into which all one's psychic activities fall, partaking of the general coloring or tonal quality of the structure itself. It corresponds to what is known in Buddhist psychology as cittagocara, or mental or consciousness field. This psychosphere, then, is the psychic atmosphere or the inner field of consciousness. We may say that it is generated within oneself while sitting in a small semi-dark room with a low ceiling, irregularly constructed, from handling the tea bowl, which is crudely formed but eloquent with the personality of the maker, and from listening to the sound of boiling water in the iron kettle over a charcoal fire. Let time pass for a while, and as one feels more composed, one begins to notice another kind of sound coming from outside the windows. It is the water dripping from a bamboo trough that conducts it from somewhere on the mountainside. The dripping is neither scanty nor excessive. It is just enough to lead the mind to a state of tranquil passivity, but the mind is really active to the extent that it can fully appreciate the synthetic effect of things surrounding the tea room outside as well as in. What constitutes the frame of mind or psychosphere thus generated here is the realization of the spirit of poverty devoid of all forms of dichotomy, subject and object, good and evil, right and wrong, honor and disgrace, body and soul, gain and loss, and so on. Kyogen Shikan, a Zen master of the late Tang dynasty, gives his idea of poverty, hin in Japanese, pin in Chinese, in the following stanza. Last year's poverty was not yet perfect. This year's poverty is absolute. In last year's poverty there was room for the head of the gimlet. This year's poverty has let the gimlet itself disappear. The poverty that permits no room for anything, even for the point of a needle, is what is known in the philosophy of Prajna Paramita as emptiness or shunyata, and the principle of the tea ceremony is based on it. For sabi or wabi is no other than the aesthetic appreciation of absolute poverty. In passing, it is of interest to note in this connection that Meister Eckhart's notion of poverty exactly coincides with Kyogen cited just above. In one of his sermons, Eckhart refers to one who is godly poor, for God can find no place in him to work in. This man is object-free in time and in eternity. There are two objects. One is otherness, the other is a man's own proper self. Unquote. This kind of man who is free of objects, that is, free of the dichotomy of subject and object, is an abodeless man, living in emptiness. Eckhart continues, True poverty of spirit requires that man shall be emptied of God and all his works, so that if God wants to act in the soul, he himself must be the place in which he acts. It is out of this absolute poverty cherished by Meister Eckhart that we also have the philosophy of tea. It is indeed out of the emptiness where there is no place, not only for God's creatures, but for God himself, because the emptiness is God, and God is the emptiness. In other words, it is out of nowhereness and no timeness that Joshu, Hofuku, Ho, and the other masters of Zen sip their cups of tea. The philosophy of tea is thus the philosophy of poverty, of shunyata, or emptiness. When this is understood, we know where the Japanese enjoyment and appreciation of the tea originates. In this respect, the ancient Japanese poem by Fujiwara Sadaie, which is often quoted by the tea men as their motto, is significant. As I look around, no flowers, no maple leaves, this fishing village, this autumnal eve. The desolation, however, is not just a stretch of sand and wilderness. One is not standing against an expanse of illimitable sea, for something of spring is already seen awakened behind the deserted boats and under the torn dragnets aired along the sea beach. To those who are forever longing for flowers, how I wish to point out green patches in the snow, fully expressive of the early spring. To an observing and discerning eye, the desolate wilderness of the late autumn already promises something of the coming spring, and every fallen leaf piling up on the ground, every withering blade of grass which had sheltered all forms of the singing insects, is already seen preparing or renewing life. As Rikyu says, the water that fills the kettle is drawn from the well of mind whose bottom knows no depth, and the emptiness which is conceptually liable to be mistaken for sheer nothingness is in fact the reservoir, the alaya of infinite possibilities. In the desolation of the late autumn we detect bits of what Sekcho, a Zen poet of the 11th century Song dynasty, sings of. The spring mountains covered with layers of most variegated colors, and the spring streams fancifully laden with the reflecting images. The tea man sitting alone in his tea room is the one whom Sekcho continues to depict as standing by himself between heaven and earth, facing infinitude of beings, Primarily, the spirit of tea is aloneness, the sitting all alone at the summit of Mount Mahavira, as stated by Hyakujo. The rice wine saquê, which is thought of as the opposite to tea, is for sociability, and mostly for conviviality, and frequently for boisterousness. Tea is aristocratic, saquê is democratic. Tea is not so expanding and non-individualistic as saquê. It is introvert and self-collective. Rihaku, the great poet of the Tang, was addicted to saquê and could not produce his creative poems without its aid. When the tea-man is inspired, his works are concentric and centripetal, full of contemplative thought. So saquê is best imbibed in company with sympathetic friends, but tea will be sipped all alone in the traditional room, 10 or even 6 feet square, in a secluded corner, away from the crowded places. The following description of a tea room is from my article on the subject which appeared in the magazine The Cultural East. The tea room is symbolic of certain aspects of Eastern culture, especially of Japanese culture. In it, we find in a most strongly and deeply concentrated form almost all the elements that go to make up what is characteristic of the Japanese mind statically viewed. As to its dynamic aspects, there are only a few signs betokening them in the tea room, where even movements are so controlled as to add to the quietude generally prevailing there. The room is small, and the ceiling not at all high, even for the stature of an average Japanese. It is devoid of decorations, except in the tokonoma, where a kakemono is hung, and before which stands a flower vase containing perhaps a solitary flower not yet in full bloom. The tokonoma is a sort of alcove occupying a corner of the room. The principal guest sits before this honored corner. A kakemono is a hanging scroll of either painting or calligraphy, which decorates the corner. As I look around, in spite of its obvious simplicity, the room betrays every mark of thoughtful designing. The windows are irregularly inserted. The ceiling is not of one pattern. The materials used, simple and unornamented, are of various kinds. The room is divided by a post obliquely setting off one corner for tea utensils, and the floor has a small square opening as a fireplace, where hot water is boiling in an artistically shaped iron kettle. The papered shoji covering the windows admit only soft light, shutting off all the direct sunshine, which when it is too strong for the tea-man's sensibility is further screened by a rustic sudare hanging just outside one of the windows. As I sit here quietly before the fireplace, I become conscious of the burning of incense. The odor is singularly nerve-soothing. The fragrant flower produces a contrary effect on the senses. The incense wood, I am told, comes from tropical countries, and is taken from old trees lying buried for a long time in water. Thus composed in mind, I hear a soft breeze passing through the needle leaves of the pine trees. The sound mingles with the trickling of water from a bamboo pipe into the stone basin. The flow and the breeze are rhythmical and soothing to the mind of the sitter inside the hut. In fact, they stimulate his meditative mood to move on to the bedrock of his being." Unquote. Thus we can see that the spirit of tea is deeply steeped in the Prajna philosophy of emptiness as taught by Zen. This Sanskrit term is generally translated as transcendental wisdom. It is a kind of intuitive knowledge in its deepest sense. When this is awakened, one has the enlightenment experience that constitutes the center of Buddhist philosophy. While the emptiness may sound too abstract for the tea-man sipping the green-colored beverage from a handmade bowl, the emptiness is in truth no less than the concreteness of reality itself. It all depends on how someone looks into the nature of things. If one's senses are alerted on the plane of relativity only, one can never rise from it. The person who sees with the eyes and hears with the ears cannot go any further than that. Unless one makes the eyes hear and the ears see, one has to stay confined within the senses. It is only when one goes out of them that one can achieve miracles by plunging into the realm of emptiness, for emptiness is the fountain of infinite possibilities. Daito Kokushi, the founder of Daitokuji, Kyoto, once had this to say: "If your ears see and eyes hear, not a doubt you'll cherish." How naturally the rain drips from the eaves.